welcome to this edition of All Politics is Local. My name is Peter Ubertasio. I'm the director of the Joseph Martin Institute for Law and Society at Stonehill College. And joining me today is the congressman from the 9th Congressional District, Democrat Bill Keating, who is running for re-election to his 4th term as a member of Congress. And so welcome, and thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us.
No, this is great. You and I talk from time to time, so now we can do it on
We do,
TV.
and it's always nice to have a conversation with you. I wanted to start by talking about just a large issue that exists, and it's not uncommon that citizens have a somewhat dim view of Congress as an institution. A lot of folks, including a lot of analysts who've studied Congress over the past 10 years, have said that there's something about the way that Congress is not functioning that seems to be broken, seems to be prone to gridlock. So I'm wondering, you've been there now for a few terms. You've been in the minority the entire time since you've been in Congress, but you also have developed a reputation for working with Republicans. And so I'm wondering if you have a sense of, from the inside, is it as broken as folks believe it is?
I think the way I view it, it's not broken as long as we have an involved and informed constituency that's out there. So it's not broken in that sense. What it is right now, it's a place of obstruction. And that's unfortunate because that obstruction, I think, largely comes from the emergence of almost a third party, the so-called Freedom Caucus, which is the Tea Party group, because they have already pushed out Speaker John Boehner, and they're now in a standoff already before we even back into session with Paul Ryan. So that is really one of the major causes of that obstruction, because traditionally we have two parties, and one's a little right of center, the other's a little left of center, and you're able to work in the middle. But that has really changed, and it's unfortunate, and it's a problem that has to be dealt with, because we're not dealing with, anytime there's a government shutdown, that's the absolute failure of government at that point. And it cost $24 billion for the 11 days it was shut down, a cost that we're still paying for in part with interest payments. So we're coming back into a Congress where there'll be great challenges surrounding that. But it'll never be broken as long as the American public stays informed, stays active, and participates, because that's the check on that kind of obstruction.
And do you get the sense from I'm assuming you do from your Democratic colleagues, but some of your Republican colleagues as
Both
well,
sides,
that they're frustrated with that?
Both sides. I would say the majority of both sides are frustrated. What I've learned over the years, at least from what I can control myself, is legislating is relationships. You build relationships with your colleagues, and that means colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I've had a Republican member from Texas over to my house here in Bourne. I've traveled with them when we visit the troops and build relationships with them. Even in the gym in the morning, I have relationships, and you build relationships with members and around issues. I've been very fortunate, I think, to build relationships around key issues for our district, building relationships with other coastal congressmen, because coastal resiliency issues right here in Sandwich are critical, even getting recognition from bipartisan groups as being named the Friend of the Coast Award. So I've worked on those areas. I've worked on flooding issues with the Republican whip from Louisiana. I've worked on national security issues with the chairman of Homeland Security and other members on airport security, on a bill that I put in, a piece of legislation that I put in to attack ISIS funding, and the Boston Marathon examination, the review we did for a whole year in Congress it was myself on the Democratic side and the chair of Homeland on the other, digging in, finding what could have happened, the red flags were missed that could have prevented that tragedy. And it was a very insightful report. And as a Democrat, the administration did not want that to be public because it showed flaws and opportunities that were missed to prevent it. But I thought it was important, so I stood alone as the only Democrat to get that public. But you also build some respect across the aisle when you do that, because they say you're just not someone that falls in line.
You've come to Congress after having spent some time in the Massachusetts Senate and then as a prosecutor. So two very different roles to prepare you for your current role, and you're back in the legislature. What has struck you as the most significant difference in Congress as an institution, the way it works, and the previous roles that you've had?
Well, I've been able to build some bonds also as a former prosecutor, because we have groups that work together on issues as former prosecutors. I think that what struck me between the Massachusetts legislature and Congress is that in Congress it's a winner-take-all system. Whoever's in power, Democrat or Republican, you have absolute control over what hits the floor. You have control over any amendment. In Massachusetts, for instance, a bill could come to the floor, and as long as it's seasonable, as long as it's generic to whatever the subject matter is, you can put an amendment in. In Congress, there's a Rules Committee that'll just say no, for no reason. And they also can control how long it's going to be debated for. They can control what the vote could be in some instances, whether it's 2/3 or 1/3, by using the procedures. So that's the biggest difference, and that's the way it has been. I would like to see somehow the rules change to make it more like the Massachusetts legislature was in that instance. I know it could be unwieldy, right, because there's so many members, but it would be very healthy to be able to vote on amendments to improve a bill or to take poison pills out of a bill.
And the speaker, he's not new anymore, but he's still just a year into the position, had stated that he'd hoped to kind of return to a sense of regular order in the House. That doesn't seem to have happened. Do you have a sense? It hasn't happened. Do you think it might with the new Congress?
I hope so.
Yeah.
But it's difficult. And again, I'm harkening back to the emergence of a third wing or a third party dealing with this. It's John Boehner would work to move legislation forward just to get the process going. And I can remember so many times when he went to his own members to secure votes to get it on the floor. And then what intervened was interaction by these super PACs. They would threaten the other Republican members, saying, you'll have a primary and $2 million against you if you don't adhere to what we want you to do, even when the Speaker of the House was trying to move the ball forward. And that's disturbing. So we're going to face maybe some of those same challenges. I hope not. And I've been able to work across the aisle at points of crisis in particular. We've had to have people work together, part of the Republican Party, part of the Democratic Party, and just saying, look, we've got to work together. But John Boehner did that and paid a price. Right. He was a pretty conservative guy, and he was being labeled as liberal by all these talk shows around the country.
I want to talk a little bit about you and your challenger in this cycle. Your Republican opponent, Mark Allegro, you two differ on a whole series of issues, pretty stark differences from climate change to healthcare. I wonder if you have thought at all about what do you think really separates you from your challenger this cycle? Well,
the most stark difference, I think the Cape Cod Times, when they came up with their editorial, they thought it was climate change because, and partly I think because fishing, aquaculture, the hospitality, restaurant, and hotel industry, all were affected by climate change. So you had to have someone that wasn't a denier of climate change there to try and get the resources. But what surprised me the most, I think, and it was not that issue, but the opioid issue. The most important first step to deal with the terrible epidemic of opioid addiction that's killing 4 people a day on average in Massachusetts, and in Barnstable County, we're the #1 county in terms of deaths in the entire Commonwealth. The #1 issue is to get past the stigma. And so when he said that opioid addiction is not a disease, it's just that's a term of political correctness. I was very surprised with that, and that's a stark difference in approaching this problem, because if you can't acknowledge it's a disease, which all the medical groups, whether it's the CDC, whether it's the Association, American Association of Addiction Medicine, whether it's National Institute of Drug, it's a chronic, reoccurring brain disease. And I learned as a DA, it's a public health issue. And I've worked across the aisle just recently getting legislation through of mine, co-sponsored aggressively by Republicans for safe prescribing for our Veterans Act, for making naloxone, which saves lives, more accessible, was signed into law by the President recently, federal funds for community take-back programs. Now, I've worked across the aisle with virtually all sides on this, and locally here in Sandwich, Randy Hunt has done a great job at the state level, and we've worked together on things that affect our region to try and deal with this terrible epidemic. But when you don't acknowledge it's even a disease, that stigma stays in place, and you don't get to first base. So that one surprised me.
This district is a diverse one, and it's changed a bit since you came in just a short time ago through redistricting. But it's still an interesting mix of urban, suburban, rural, lots of different kind of occupations and employment patterns in this district. What have you found as you have gone through the district, gotten to know the people in the new parts of the district that were added just, I guess, 2 cycles ago? What are the particular challenges in representing a diverse district like this in Congress?
Actually, there's a lot more commonality than people would think. And I think the biggest areas, and the most important, I think, is dealing with the economic issues, driving this part of the state forward economically. And I think that whether it's starting at the earliest of times as I think preschool, Head Start issues, so that we have our young people here that are getting an education that's going to allow them to be qualified, trained, educated for the jobs of the future. Whether it's working at the community college level with 4 Cs, Cape Cod Community College, getting some grants for jobs that need people, like the avionics industry grant that is in place, and they're training in Plymouth in conjunction with Cape Cod Community College, or retention grants to help make sure those students stay there. What they've done with the affordability, with the 2+2 program, 2 years at community college and 2 years in a 4-year college, and getting that for a combined $30,000 in tuition. That's important for our economy going forward. Plus, trying to work in our regions for the traditional economies. We have some of the smaller communities on the cranberry industry. We've worked with them with the Export-Import Bank so they get new markets so they can grow and have more jobs here. We've worked on the fishing side in an industry that's plagued by climate change and by some onerous regulations, I think, too. Trying to sustain those industries and have them go forward, but also looking for the new industries. We're going to be right off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, the center in the country for offshore wind. That's a new industry that's so important going forward, but it's also a job creator, and there'll be spin-offs from that. And investing in not just our community college, but we have Woods Hole and the institutions there. We have UMass Dartmouth, SMass, and other groups there for research. That research will create jobs. Now, next door in Bourne, for instance, just one good example, Hydroid, a company expanded there, and they had the president from Scandinavia, Denmark, was there, and he, was there for the opening. I said, "Why did you locate here?" And he said, "Well, it wasn't the least expensive place, but you were close. I was close to the research, the scientific research. So if you do that, and you have a skilled workforce that's here, you'll be dealing with an issue demographically we have to confront here in the Cape, and that's keeping young people here."
Yeah, it's one of the more significant issues, the brain drain.
Driving the economy forward. In Marshfield, which is part of my district, there's going to be a community college there centered on maritime jobs. And between that and Mass Maritime, the people graduating from there, they're choosing among 4 and 5 jobs right now, good jobs. So that's the future. And that's the same, whether it's a city area or whether it's a small towns. And some of the needs are the same. Small towns are having trouble with public safety issues in terms of hiring enough fire personnel. So there are grants that we've worked hard at through Homeland Security to secure safer grants, they're called, for extra firefighters. And that's been the case in Sandwich and in Fall River and New Bedford. So sometimes, whether it's a big city or a small town, they have the same.
And I'm wondering if
problem.
is there one, as you've toured the district, particularly during this election season, are you hearing one thing over and over again? Is there something that really does stand out in terms of what folks on the ground or local officials are telling you they're in most need of? It's the opioid crisis or something to that
Well, the opioid
nature.
crisis, clearly.
It's impacting
I'm hearing
everyone
that.
from
Yeah,
all
this is
corners.
just not unique to here.
Right.
And I hear that probably as much as anything. And I also hear a concern in the Cape. There was a huge concern not long ago, which shows you where sometimes the federal government has to come in and work to intervene. In the hospitality industry, restaurants and hotels, because of a confluence of things, the perfect storm of things that could happen, the delays on the visas for people to come in and work were going to be delayed till the end of June. I was told by the chamber that this would cost, just tens of millions of dollars every month of delay, at least. And we were able to intervene, change the process they were doing on the run, and move that up to the normal starting time. So those are the things. The direct pocketbook issues are real issues too, because a lot of our industry in the Cape Cod area and the islands, it's seasonal. And if you're not making that money during the season, it's lost, and you cease to be profitable. So it's you're working without a net in many of these industries. So it doesn't take much to throw it off. So I heard that from everyone during the spring, but you didn't hear much of it afterwards because we were able to avert it. But I also hear, obviously in this area, about the coastal issues that are such a concern. And in Sandwich, we've worked hard with the Army Corps and with the town. The town has really worked hard. But we've had the Army Corps now doing a study, which I didn't think necessarily would ever get off the ground, that deals with who's responsible because of some of the work that was done maybe
Sure.
decades
Quite
ago.
a while ago.
That we're living with now. And the importance of that is if we can prove that that's done, that might open doors for funding, so the town is not spending as much
So
as well.
you're talking about the jetty that was built on the canal that
exactly.
prevents the replenishment of the town neck beaches
That's right.
on that side of Sandwich.
And the town wanted to see if they would go back and do a study to say, how did this occur, who's responsible? And in the beginning, we tried, and I tried to keep the expectation level because I know that's not what they like to do, go back and assess who's responsible. But we got that off the ground, and it's in process, and that could be something that could be extremely helpful going forward.
Your opponent would make the claim, I don't want to speak for him, but his view of government is that it's too large, too complex, doing too many things that it should not do, or that might better be done at a local, state, or regional level, closer to a locality. I just wonder your general view on that kind of writ large politics. Is the federal government grown too big to function efficiently? Is the complexity, even as you described with the Army Corps as one small example, is it understandable, or is it something that we can try to reduce?
Well, there's certain things that have always been the traditionals of the state, criminal justice systems largely, and education largely. But there's some things that you need a federal government on. I mean, we're in a small patchwork quilt of New England states. You can't deal with environmental issues state to state because you won't be effective in dealing with that. You can't deal with national infrastructure issues state to state. That doesn't work as well. You can't, I don't think, have a country whose economy moves forward as a country, which helps us all, without some kind of basis of support for community colleges, it's helping that go forward, or colleges. There's things that we do collectively that'll produce more revenue for our country, and that type of limited view of the national government focuses on, well, we should just worry about the national defense. The rest should be in the hands of, and that's really where they believe that it's that limited. Well, if I spend a great deal of my time on national security issues, and I must tell you this, the most important national security issue is a strong U.S. economy. And generals will tell you that. Because without that, we can't solve everything militarily. Look what we've been able to do with sanctions around the world for countries that were doing bad deeds. Look what our strength is. Look why people listen to us. Look how we can, be a source to prevent wars because of our economy. So if you're not viewing that economy in a national sense, the limited area that they're talking about, our national military, isn't going to be effective. So you can't live in that world. That world might have been something that was more relevant a century and a half ago, but it's not relevant today, not with the global competition that exists.
Speaking of the national security issues, and from your vantage point, new president taking office in January, what do you think is the single most significant issue in a national security front that the new president will
Well,
have
number
to
one,
confront?
I just said the economy is number one, and people are missing that, and we should be talking about it more. Number two, when you're looking at engagement, I think we have to look at what we're spending, without any backup. There was just a study that the two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, pushed our debt up $5 trillion. And we're not backing that up with anything. We're doing it on a credit card. When we look at this, again, getting back to our economy, we have to look at how are we funding these, and can we just continue to spend the money we're spending with so many different places. So this commonality of agreement about being wise on our defense spending and not doing it in an unbridled manner. But I do think that we have to look at what we can do and what we can't do. There were lessons learned in Iraq. We never should have gone to Iraq. I wasn't there then, but we never should have gone there. It was a terrible mistake in many respects. And if we try and nation build all around the world, we're doomed to failure. It's going to drain us, it's going to make us weaker, and it won't be effective. We have an enormously strong military, the best in the world, nothing's close to it. So we could go in ourselves, for instance, and wipe out the footprint of where ISIS is right now. And we could do that. And what happens after that? Are we going to hold that forever? Are we going to make sure that it's guarded? Because these other factions that go back centuries in their conflicts, civil wars, tribes, religions, they'll wait us out, and they'll use guerrilla warfare. So, for instance, the strategy there is one where our special operations are helping, where we are a difference maker, but we can't fall into the trap of seizing areas where ultimately you need a situation where the Sunni Arabs, for instance, in much of that region, they have to come in and occupy it. They have to self-govern there. We can't do that, or else we'll be in another Iraq situation and it'll be a disaster. So we have to make sure, we're very cognizant of a long-range strategy. Don't jump into something short-range, even if you can be successful in the short run, if you can't be successful in the long run. So that's one of the things I think that's important. And it's incumbent upon all of us in government to do a better job conveying that to the public. Because if you listen to this presidential campaign, all the way around, you hear people making claims, we should put in 20,000 people on the ground, we should build a new naval fleet, that's not the way to view good U.S. security strategy.
And as you and I talk, we're just 1 week, just under 1 week away from your election, but also the end of a presidential election, which has, I think, for most of us, been somewhat dispiriting. And
You're kind.
I'm trying to be kind.
I can't wait.
When I talk to my students about elections, we always want to live in the moment: who's up, who's down, who's winning a state, who's up in a poll. But I encourage them to think about any given election as kind of a tile in a mosaic.
Right.
And it has particular characteristics, but it doesn't tell us everything we want to know about the state of American politics. However, it's big and it's important. So as you have followed the national race, what's your takeaway from this? What does your gut tell you about where we're headed as a country, given what you've seen during the presidential election?
Well, it's not going to be over after November 8th. This has been something that didn't occur out of a vacuum. The description of the House I explained to you, is a problem. The fact that on either side you have people that aren't happy with the people that are running in the last analysis. I think one thing, some of the things we could do, and I think you're talking about institutional changes, I think we could do something to have higher vote turnouts, and in some states it's hard for independent voters to partake in primaries. They should be opened up. The higher the voter turnout, the more participation, therefore, of independent voters. I think the healthier it is for the country, because the extremes will be,
Right. So you think of like
down
the
because it's so
California system where
that's
everyone runs
that's
in
one
one
thing to look
primary
at,
and
but
the top two.
also some states don't allow independents to get involved in that. We should have that involvement. The other thing is the gerrymandering that took effect has been terrible for the institution, because people can't lose. The parties can't lose. They've concentrated Democratic districts, concentrated Republican districts, and that's not healthy either. That has to change as well. And the third thing, I think, major thing we have to look at, and some of it's hindered by constitutional decisions, the Citizens United decision, but the influence of money has been a huge factor, as well as the for-profit media. When people go for their news, they'll go to the cable news stations, but I think not often do they realize that they're all for-profit entities. So what they're doing, they're carving out a minority of the general populace, whether it's to the left or the right, and they're selling their advertisement based on the fact that that's their sponsorship. And you don't have a media through some of these programs that's at all balanced, and the public gets that. And that's why you're seeing some reactions, even in the debates, when people are angry at the media. I think they're reacting to the fact that we've moved to such a for-profit media on these cable shows, and that the speed in which it's a 24/7 cycle.
Sure.
And the speed of information and the competition among groups. In the days not long ago with the media, there would be a story, and a journalist would have to have, depending on their policy, 2 or 3 confirmations for that story. Today, if you do that, you're always last in coming to the news. So these things are just spewing out there without any kind of check or filtering.
And you think that's driving some of the anger?
Yeah, so I think if you look at some of the things, the gerrymandering, getting better, broader voter participation, particularly from independent voters, opening the doors for a lot of them to, have their votes count on the primaries, dealing with the money that's there in the gerrymandering. Those are real pillars that we should be looking at to see what we can do to change this.
Right.
There's no one silver bullet, but all of those things I mentioned, if we can improve along those lines, we'll have a healthier, more bipartisan country. And in the last analysis, that's a healthy thing. We've been suffering these last few years with the equivalent of 3 parties, and we're really built for a 2-party system. We're not a parliamentary system. So I think as you look at institutions and the kind of things you teach, those are the issues we should be looking at. And we can do some things to make the situation better.
Before we end, Congressman, I just wonder, we're from such a storied part of the country, such a historical part of the United States. Is there someone in history, it doesn't have to be from Massachusetts, but is there someone in history that you consider to be a role model for the way you approach your job?
Well, what came to mind early on was John Quincy Adams. He came from a very, extraordinary family. He was so qualified, and he was President of the United States. But what did he do after that? He went back to Congress, and he served, at a much lower level because it was public service, and did his part going forward. And I thought that's an extraordinary example of public service. How many presidents of the United States would go back to Congress and go back to that kind of public service? I look at I look at that as something exemplary. And then a person that most people, but you at Stonehill certainly knew well, Congressman Joe Moakley. And the thing that impressed me with him, and I've known him for years before he passed away, was he was the same person when he got elected as he was before. And he became very influential, chairman of rules in Congress, but it never changed. He was the same guy. And so I look at those two for those two reasons, and I say, you know, to me, those are great attributes.
And two legends within Massachusetts
That's right.
politics or in different times. Well, Congressman Bill Keating, thanks for joining us today.
Great. Well, thank you.